Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. My name is Josh Heuman, and I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs at the Power Plant Contemporary Art Gallery in Toronto. The Power Plant is often regarded as one of Canada's leading contemporary visual art organizations. We certainly intersect with other art forms, but today we're really focusing on grant writing for artists, visual artists in particular, recognizing as part of a Toronto Arts Council open door funded initiative that's called Horizon. It's a sort of an ad hoc collective of 9 organizations, including the Power Plant, that has been working for already more than 2 years and will wind up its activities at the end of August of this year, August of 2021, really looking to address needs and expectations of visual artists in Toronto in particular. And so during year 1 of this initiative, the 9 partner organizations conducted focus groups and town halls to learn more about the needs and expectations of artists in our community. And during year 2, which has been variously delayed and extended because of the COVID pandemic and has shifted online, of course, there have been a number of programs by the Power Plant and the other Horizon Initiative partner organizations that address some of those needs. The main sort of primary need expressed by artists is greater financial stability. And so it seemed quite logical that one of the programs should deal with grants at all 3 levels of government, municipal, provincial, and federal, which often cover various costs, materials, supplies, production costs, labor, and so on. We are incredibly grateful to representatives from all 3 levels of government. Again, Peter Kingstone, Toronto Arts Council, Say Gu with Ontario Arts Council, and Isidra Cruz with the Canada Council for the Arts. So I will introduce each one in turn, and they will speak sort of specifically about grants that their agencies, that their councils have available for artists. Certainly much more information is to be found on the websites of these agencies. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time at the end for some questions and answers from our audience. So we're going to start with Toronto, move to Ontario, and then to Canada Council. So our first speaker is Peter Kingstone, a Toronto-based visual artist and curator, working primarily in video and photography. As an independent artist, his installation pieces have been shown across Canada and internationally, and he was awarded the United Artist Award in 2005 for his installation, The Strange Case of Peter K., 1974 to 2004. Peter holds a degree in philosophy and cultural studies from Trent University in Peterborough, and a master's of fine arts focusing on video and new media from York University in Toronto. Peter has presented at many conferences on the ideas around storytelling and social engagement. And he started in September of 2012 as the acting visual media arts program manager at the Toronto Arts Council. So welcome, Peter.
Hello, everyone. So I'm no longer acting, but that's when I started. Yes, I'm still a practicing artist. I spent a decade teaching at York, OCAD, and U of T. And then I started working at the Toronto Arts Council, now going on 9 years. It feels like 9 years have flown past. But this idea of stability that the Power Plant's putting forward, I can talk about in a couple of different ways, and also like to talk about the Toronto Arts Council grants programs. But one of the reasons why I'm working at the Toronto Arts Council instead of being, working solely as an artist, as I had done in the previous, is stability. I'm not going to recommend that everyone gets a council job or gets a full-time job, but for me, that's why I ended up here where I am. But I love where I am, and I love doing what I do, so it has worked for me. The other thing, the Toronto Arts Council, which is an arm's length organization from the City of Toronto. So the City of Toronto gives the Toronto Arts Council a $23 million grant, and then we disseminate that grant across the City of Toronto. So we're not a government agency necessarily. We are, a parapublic agency that's every year has to get their grant agreed upon by the city. So the Toronto Arts Council also is starting to look into income. And we've spent the year during this pandemic year thinking about basic incomes or guaranteed basic incomes, and are joining the fight to push provincially or the federal government into thinking about guaranteed basic income for everyone, with the thought of a basic income for artists. That said, to talk about the main grant that I help run is the Visual Artists Grant, which I assume the majority of you would be interested in. The Visual Artists Grant, you can apply to at any time throughout the year except for October. I get to take October off talking to visual artists, but otherwise you can apply. Once you apply, you'll find out if you receive the grant in approximately 4 months. There's 2 levels of grant. One is if you're a beginning artist for 7 years or less, or just shown locally, sort of around Toronto, you can apply for $5,000. And the level 2, 7 years or more, you have a local, a national or international name, you're applying for $10,000. These grants are creation grants. These grants are not to put up a show. These are to make new work. So you're applying with your ideas on the work that you'll be making. We'd like to see that you're applying with, an artist statement, what you've been working on in the past, where this new work is going to take you, and how it's going to engage with an audience. Many questions that I have from visual artists is, does this work have to have anything to do with Toronto? And it's no, you do not have to do anything with Toronto. You just have to live in the city of Toronto. So that's an M postal code. So that's anywhere from Etobicoke to Scarborough, from the water to North York. And then, we do not have a budget for this program. So, or the applicants aren't asked to create a budget for the program. So you're either applying for $5,000 or $10,000. I'm always available to look over your grant for you before you hand it in and talk through it and talk about your ideas. That's the best part about my job, is talking about ideas, meeting artists. In the before times, I would go for coffee a lot with artists, or meet them wherever they like to meet. I'm hoping to get back to that once we can actually see each other without masks, but I'm also fine doing Zoom or emails or phone calls. You can go to the torontoartscouncil.org, or peter@torontoartscouncil.org is my email. I mean, the other grants that visual artists can apply for would be the artists in the parks, or arts in the parks, artists in the streets, the libraries grants. These are all grants that are attached to location. None of them are creation grants. These are more, some of them are community-based grants or more dissemination grants to show the world your work. And they can be, as I said, in a park or on the streets or in a library. So all these grants are also available for individual visual artists. And if you're thinking, about putting up a show, we only fund ad hoc groups or organizations to put up shows. And that shows can be a series of talks, or it can be a show in a gallery, it could be a show outside. It could even be a residency if you're thinking about starting a new residency. So maybe I'll just leave it there and have and the other two sort of explain what they get themselves up to. And I'm happy to take your questions when we get to that point. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter, for that very concise review of how the TAC functions in terms of grants. And I can say from the power plant, though we're not an artist, we're an arts organization, we have certainly consulted with you on grants that we have been preparing to submit. So really a great service that you provide in that sense.
Yeah, please reach out. I mean, I tried to be concise. I didn't know where I was going, but if there's any questions, please ask.
Excellent. So we'll move on to our second speaker. Tse Gu has been active in Ontario's visual arts community for over 15 years. Prior to joining the Ontario Arts Council in 2013, she held a number of roles in Ontario Public Art Galleries, including Gallery Stratford, where she served as executive director for 6 years, as well as Cambridge Galleries, Grimsby Public Art Gallery, and the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. Her areas of responsibility have included curation and collection management, community collaboration, strategic planning, and finance and administration. And she currently serves as a visual arts officer at the Ontario Arts Council. So thank you so much, Tse.
Thanks so much, Josh. Thank you to you and the power plant for the invitation. I'm really happy to be here with all of you. I will share my screen. So I'll just take a moment to do that. So a little bit about the Ontario Arts Council, or OAC, as you might hear us refer to from time to time. I'll mention that the OAC, we're an arm's length agency of Ontario's Ministry of Heritage, Sport, Tourism, and Cultural Industries. And our primary goal is to support Ontario-based Toronto artists, ad hoc groups and collectives, as well as organizations. So I wanted to, in the short time that we have together, highlight a few grant programs for you, as well as provide some grant writing tips, I think particularly focused for individual artists. So in terms of OAC programs, we have over 60 grant programs organized under 4 major streams. The first is creating and presenting stream, which provides grants to artists for making your work or sharing your work with an audience. We also have the building audiences and market stream, which is grant support for outreach, touring, and collaboration projects. We have engaging schools and communities, which support activities to offer opportunities for professional artists to connect with and work with community members, as well as developing skills and careers, which provides training, mentorship, and capacity building support. Our grant programs are also organized by discipline. So OAC supports dance, theater, music, media arts, visual arts, literature, as well as multi and inter arts. I'll focus primarily in terms of grant programs for visual artists. And I'll mention 2 grant programs that are probably our most well-subscribed programs for visual artists. One is called the Visual Artist Creation Projects Program. So this is for creation costs, expenses for artists to make new work. And the program has 3 program categories. One is for emerging artists for grants of $5,000 with 3 years of independent professional practice or more. For mid-career artists, which is a grant of $7,500 for artists who have a practice of 8 years or more. And lastly, a grant for established artists as well. And this is a program that's primarily there to support expenses that you might encounter as you make new work. So that could be materials and supplies, could be your studio rent and artist fee, and that's to yourself for your time to make your work, as well as to collaborators that you may be working with throughout your project, as well as dependent care costs that you might have and travel costs related to making your work if your work requires that. We also have a companion program that we call Exhibition Assistance. So the expenses covered here are a little bit different. So it's more on the presentation side. If you have an upcoming exhibition, for example, and this is again for individual artists or those working within a collective context. And these are grants between $500 and $2,000. And we work with a number of what we call our recommender partners throughout different zones in Ontario who help us make the grant decisions. And this is more for presentation costs such as framing, crating, shipping your work, installation hardware, renting a space to show your work, as well as promotional expenses and insurance as well. And just briefly highlighting a few other programs within the visual arts section. So we do also fund curators as well. So a few programs that may be of interest to you, a program called Visual Arts Projects for curators, collectives, and organizations. So you can request up to $10,000 to either support your time to research a project or present a project with Ontario artists or a publication project as well. We also have a curatorial project program for independent Indigenous and curators of color who are partnering with galleries or artist-run centers to present a project, and you can request up to $30,000 for your research time for to pay fees to artists or collaborators and your presentation and promotional costs. And also we have a craft-based program for curators as well as artists, and the grants range from $5,000 to $15,000 towards research and creation as well as dissemination. And by craft, we're referring to work that is functional, conceptual, sculptural, or from an art and design perspective. Lastly, I'll just highlight a few programs within our suite of programs that are for artists working in all artistic disciplines, so not just visual arts. We have a skills and career development program for Indigenous arts professionals and arts professionals of color, in which you can request up to $10,000 for professional development opportunities, as well as to document your work. And lastly, to highlight one of our brand new programs that just launched this spring. This is a pilot program that we're running for 2 years. It's called the Artist Presenter Collaboration Projects. And this is a grant between $20,000 and $30,000. It's a temporary program that we're testing out, and it supports relationship building between artists, organizations, as well as audiences. So 2 categories that we have are for networking and market development opportunities, as well as for presentation and engagement opportunities, with the emphasis on long-term relationship building and network development. So just a few notes about the OAC application process. Just wanted to bring forward a few notes to you. All of our applications are accepted through our online grant system, and it does take a bit of time for us to work through our process once we receive your application. So just giving you a sense of the time frame when you apply to the OAC. We also use a peer assessment process to allocate funds for essentially all of our project programs. Meaning that your applications will be read and evaluated by artists in your field. Most of our applications will have 4 components. So it will ask you for, through a series of questions, for you to describe your artistic context and project. It will also ask for artistic examples of your past work, as well as support documents in some programs, such as confirmation or support letters. And some programs will have a budget form as well for you to indicate your project expenses and revenues. Our programs are also assessed in 3 core areas, so artistic merit, impact, and viability. Each application is scored by assessors using an evaluation rubric for the program, and the rubric is published on our website, where the applicants can review what information the assessors will be using to evaluate each application. The 3 core areas are artistic merit, meaning a look at your artist statement, a project description, and artistic examples, as well as impact of the project on the applicant, and potentially for community members and artists if you are working with others through your project. And the last is viability, meaning your work plan and your budget. I wanted to share some grant writing tips with you. OEC grant programs are quite competitive. So the thing that I'm asked, I think probably the most often, aside from what the program might cover, is really how does one put together a strong application that will fare well during assessment discussions and ultimately be successful in terms of getting a grant. So one of the things that we essentially ask for, and I would say all of our project programs, is that we have a tell us about yourself section. And this is an opportunity for assessors to understand the context for your artistic practice. I like to encourage artists to really tell your story using your authentic voice, and to write with the passion that you have for your project, for your I think artistic goals, to really highlight those for the assessors. So talk about what influences you in your work, what's important to you in your practice, who do you want to work with, what are your artistic goals for your project, but most importantly to talk about that in your authentic voice, and to do that with the passion that you have for your practice. We also have a project description section in terms of asking artists to talk about what are you planning to do and what you want to achieve. So this is really the what, who, why, and where and how of your project. So really giving assessors a sense of what you want to achieve with your project, what your artistic goals are, and if you're working with others in your project, to really talk about why you want to collaborate and how you plan to achieve those goals. We also do assess impact. So in your impact section, talk about your artistic practice and how your project will impact you on a short-term or long-term basis, and how the project will impact your collaborators, community, or other stakeholders that you may be working with. Lastly, our viability section. This is your opportunity to talk about your work plan or your budget, talk about whether your project is scalable, whether you're applying for other grants. One of the crucial aspects of OAC assessment is artist fees. So if you are working with others, for example, or working with a mentor, and in terms of your time that you're allocating to the project, is that we really do want to see artists compensated appropriately for your time and your work. So in your budget section, talk about how you determined your fees, whether you use a professional standard such as CARFAC or other industry rates in terms of determining your fees. And also if you've done the research to determine what your project costs are. And a few last notes. So provide good support materials such as confirmation letters from collaborators or mentors if requested. One of the other crucial aspects of assessment is strong artistic examples within the context of your application. So we tend to suggest recent work, so that could be within the last 2 to 5 years if that's available to you, although we recognize that artists may also take breaks in your practice as well. But if you have your strongest artistic examples, and if possible related to your project. And lastly, to say that because grant applications are assessed by a jury of your peers, OAC grants are competitive, so as you're putting your application together, to really put yourself at the table. So if you're reviewing, for example, 150 applications, knowing that perhaps only a third of them will be funded, what would you look for in a strong application? And take into the considerations of the program objectives and priorities. Is the application compelling, timely, relevant, well-researched, planned, and thoughtful? So lastly, I'll mention that we do have some application supports for deaf applicants and applicants who identify as with a disability. And that happens in two forms, as application support. So you could request support if you are collaborating with a service provider or support worker as you put together your application, as well as application support of up to $5,000 to cover the costs of accessibility or accommodation expenses that you might have to carry out your project. So I think I'll pause here, and I'm happy to take your questions later on. But a good starting point for OAC grants is, as Josh mentioned earlier, our website, which has all of the program guidelines, and also happy to hear from you at any time through email or call. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tsay. Really appreciate that overview of how the Ontario Arts Council handles the granting process as well. So again, any of our listeners, if you're having questions, sort of save them up. We'll reach that point and have some minutes at the end for questions and answers. But for now, we will move on to our third speaker. We are equally delighted to have Isidra Cruz, who is a Mexican Cree arts administrator and costume designer. Isidra has focused her attention on working in the Indigenous arts community with organizations such as Imaginative Film and Media Arts Festival, Native Earth Performing Arts, and as the Indigenous Arts Program Manager at the Toronto Arts Council, and the Associate Indigenous Arts Officer at the Ontario Arts Council. So she recently worked as the Program Manager for the Indigenous Community Performing Arts Fund, which is a partnership between the Indigenous Performing Arts Alliance and the Department of Canadian Heritage. She is currently a Program Officer for Creating, Knowing, and Sharing the Arts and Cultures of First Nations, Inuit, and Metis peoples at the Canada Council for the Arts. So welcome, Isidra.
Thanks. Hello, everyone. So as he mentioned, I'm at the Canada Council for the Arts, and it is the national arts funding body. So there's two big differences at Canada Council from the other funders, and that is, one, we don't divide our programs by artistic practice. It's more divided up by sort of the concept of what people are doing, and less by artistic practice. And you need to create a profile in order to apply for our grants. And that is the key. So I'll just spend a moment talking about that. So the profile creation, when you go to our website, it'll say portal in the right-hand corner. And so you'll click on that and go through the steps of creating a profile. To create a profile, you need to have an artistic CV to create one, and then you pick your artistic practice within, and they need to sort of match up. So if you have spent most of your time as a photographer, then you'd probably apply to visual arts as a visual arts professional artist. And if you are an Indigenous artist, it's a little different. So we don't divide it by artistic practice right down to the profile aspect of it. So you just identify as either an aspiring artist, a professional artist, a professional arts worker, or a cultural carrier. Within the larger body of Canada Council, there's also a cultural connector profile for people within various, so not just Indigenous communities, but other communities who might not necessarily be the definition of a professional artist, but their work is very much entrenched in art and community and connecting the two. So those are pretty key ones. We suggest you create your profile 30 days before a deadline. We try our best to get the profiles approved and processed, but there's no guarantee. So if you are thinking about applying, or even if you're not thinking about applying this year to Canada Council, make a profile. Just make it, have it there, ready to go, because that is sort of the biggest hurdle to get to apply. So you don't get access to the applications until you have that approved profile. So the programs that are available for visual artists is, the main program is Explore and Create. So as I mentioned, it's not based on artistic practice, it's based on what you're doing. So the components to Explore and Create are professional development for artists. So these are smaller grants that are internally assessed. So they usually have a quicker turnaround time. And they are for people to apply for professional development, such as some common ones that we've been getting are people who are training within sort of anti-racism and diversity programs, HR, developing their HRs. Those ones are specifically, targeted towards arts professionals. But obviously, if there's a course or a mentorship that you would like to take on to advance your career, you would apply to professional development for artists. Next, we have research and creation, which is a project grant to support the creative research and development and the creation of new works by artists. So for example, it would be used to create a series of paintings. And then we have concept to realization. So that is where your project or composite grants to support activities that will result in the completion of works to be shown to the public. So this is where you would apply to do an arts show. So those are the main ones within Explore and Create. If you're Indigenous, then we have short-term projects and long-term projects. And those ones are all assessed together. All of the artistic practices are assessed together. And much like the Explore and Create programs, with the exception of the professional development for artists, they are peer assessed. So it's made up of peers from within your community. If it's the Indigenous Arts Program, the peer assessors are comprised of Indigenous artists from across Canada and across artistic disciplines. So all of this is sort of on the website, which is the main resource, but I wanted to highlight those things. And then, just a couple quick tips for applying, some really simple things that might seem obvious, but sometimes it's easy to forget. Number one, make sure your project dates line up with your timeline. So the project grants, they require a timeline, and there's very specific things about the deadline. So I do believe this is the same for TAC and OAC, but your project cannot start before the deadline. That is key. And depending on where you're applying, which program you're applying to, your project might not be able to be longer than a year. So short-term projects in the Indigenous Arts Program is 1 year, 12 months. So you want to make sure that you are watching those dates, because it's a really easy way to get your application made ineligible. So because we're the National Arts funder, our volume of applications is quite high. And so we can't sort of like make exceptions, and if you're missing something, we sort of just can't help in that sense because of the sheer volume of applications. So you really want to make sure that you have all the parts to your application there and ready to go. The most obvious, don't leave it to the last minute. And more importantly, don't leave uploading your support documents to the last minute. You know, at the end of the day, we're artists. A lot of us procrastinate, me. And so it's very easy for me to say this, but then be the person who leaves it to the last moment. Even if you leave the writing part to a little later, make sure that you've uploaded your support documents, because if you're having issues, once the deadline has passed, we cannot help you. And if you do not have support documents as part of your grant, it is incomplete and will not go to jury. So once again, these little sort of things, our deadline is 11:59 p.m. on the day of the deadline. So if you leave it to the last moment and you're trying to get a hold of somebody at 8 o'clock at night, being like, my thing won't upload, unfortunately, most of us are not working at that point. And so if you don't get it uploaded, you kind of are pooched. So unfortunately. So those are some like very key things to think about. And just read on the website, make sure to review what is eligible, what is not eligible based on programs. Overall, at all levels, capital costs are not eligible. So, you know, you can't really buy a computer or buy a building. So you need to really like look at those eligibility things, because it is very different from program to program. So for example, Explore and Create versus the Indigenous Creating, Knowing and Sharing at Canada Council, self-publishing is allowed in Creating, Knowing and Sharing, but is not allowed in Explore and Create. So yeah, read the stuff. Read the website. And if you have issues with the portal, definitely get in contact with us. And then sort of just one last thing to highlight is that we have a new profile within the larger portion of council, and it's called the New and Early Career Artist. So it is for anyone who is, you know, just fresh out of school, has less than 2 years experience as a professional artist. You can't be an actual student, but yeah, less than 2 years of professional work would make you a new and early career artist. And it's a great sort of way to get your foot in the door at the council. And for the Creating, Knowing, Sharing the Indigenous program, we have aspiring artists, which is also less than 2 years experience, professional experience. And now I'll leave it for questions.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Isidra. I wonder if I could invite Peter and Say back onto their videos. So, I mean, I have a couple of questions, but then I wonder if the audience has any questions at all. You could use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We have, I'll be peeking, and we have another person sort of peeking there. So I wonder, Say mentioned that, and I don't know if this is an accurate number or sort of, an example, but, potentially of 150 applicants, there might be 50 approved. So I wonder among the TAC, OAC, and Canada Council, like if there's like a rough percentage of how many grants are approved each year. So Peter, perhaps?
Each year in visual artists?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, every single discipline or grants program at TAC has a different percentages depending on how many people are applying and what the discipline is and how it's supporting it. So in visual arts, we receive about 400 to 450 applications per year, and about 20% are successful. So what is that, 80? That makes sense. Yeah, between 80 to 100 are successful.
Cool. And Say, was your 150 and 50 accurate? So about 30%, or?
It really depends on the program. So similar to what Peter says, really it varies by program and by discipline. I would say for the OAC, our most well-subscribed disciplines are music and visual arts. So specifically in the visual artist creation program, I might see anywhere from 600 to 800 applications a year. And the success rate is depending on how many have applied. It could be 1 in 5 or 1 in 4 artists who've applied. So again, it varies by program. But I would say the visual artist program, and then similar to our music programs, are highest volume programs typically.
Wonderful, thank you. And Isidra, I wonder if you can give us a sense.
Surprisingly, well, not surprisingly, but very awesomely, Explore and Create and Creating and Knowing and Sharing share the same sort of success rate, which is about 35 to like 45% success rate, which is really great. Both programs have also gotten a top up of funds this year. So we're looking at making our success rates much better. In terms of the amount of applications, I don't want to scare anybody, so I won't say anything about how many applications.
A lot.
A lot.
A lot.
A lot.
Because that is nationwide. So
exactly.
Of course, people in Ontario and then people in Toronto, most of the people who are in our audience right now are Toronto based. So, it's like Toronto may be the largest city, but there are applicants from all across the country, every province, every territory.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned a top up. I'm figuring that's because of COVID. So I sort of a follow-up question for all three of you. And maybe we'll go in reverse order. This time is, what has been done because of COVID or in response to COVID specifically?
So at Canada Council, at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a couple different sort of access points for emergency funds, both for one for organizations and also for individual artists. And then in Creating, Knowing, and Sharing, we partnered with the Aboriginal Arts Collective, which I think are now called the Indigenous Arts Collective.
Yeah, Indigenous Curatorial Collective.
Thank you. Yeah. I was like, they just changed their name.
Yeah.
They partnered with them. And so Indigenous artists, it was like a first come, first serve. Everyone who applied got $1,000 as sort of a stay afloat, please feed yourself program. So there's been that for sure.
Yeah, because there's been at the same time as the pandemic, also like food prices have skyrocketed, and rents continue to go up and so on. So I'm sure that that is very much appreciated. I wonder, say, about the Ontario Arts Council and COVID.
For sure. So last year we launched a one-time program. We tried to do that fairly quickly in the summer after things were really shifting in the communities in the spring. And it was called the Arts Response Initiative, and it was for individual artists, collectives, or organizations, and it funded some aspects of support and expenses. So maybe I'll refer to the one for individual artists that we normally don't fund in other programs. So it was capital costs and distinctly prioritizing pieces that artists needed to have access to right away to overcome specifically COVID-related barriers. So those were fairly well subscribed programs. So we had over 1,000 applications, for example, from individual artists, and about 450, I think, from collectives and organizations, and another stream as well for partners, for those who are collaborating in communities to support each other. But looking at not necessarily creation or presentation that we might fund in other programs, but just some different aspects for artists to, for example, upgrade their studios or get some technology support or build some promotional capacity for themselves going forward, because they weren't necessarily able to rely on others in the community to do some of that work with them or for them if they're working in isolation.
Excellent, thank you so much. And Peter, how about the TAC?
So March of last year, right when the pandemic started, within 2 weeks, TAC launched a program to help artists who'd be losing wages. So they, through the TAC and the TAF, which is the Toronto Arts Foundation, got close to $1 million and helped 800 individual artists across the city of Toronto, or even more than 800 artists, to give them enough money to keep going, the money that they were expecting from a gig that had been lost. We also, gave all the operating clients their money right at the beginning of as soon as we got the money, they got the money, instead of holding it back for whatever reasons we can sometimes hold money back to operating clients. And then, but apart from the COVID, TAC has an Indigenous arts grant, but we're launching, I think by the end of this summer, there'll be a Black Arts grant, which is very exciting. We've been talking about it with the community since June of last year, and it's about to be launched, I think, in about a month and a half. So if that is appealing to anyone in the audience, please keep your eyes open.
That's fantastic. And, I think all underrepresented voices across the board, have to be brought to the surface. So certainly as soon as the power plant hears about it, we'll spread the word among our e-newsletter folks. I guess I have one more question, and I don't see any in the Q&A yet. So this may be the last question unless something pops up. So I know from Isidra that interdisciplinarity, it's sort of like all like packaged into one, kind of. So I wonder if all three of you could speak about what happens if there are applications or proposals for projects that are cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary. So would someone apply, let's say a visual artist, apply only for the visual arts aspect of that? Could they embed the interdisciplinary aspects into that same application? Or can they apply for that like to another area within your agency for that interdisciplinary component? I know that was like a very complicated question. So maybe we'll start with Say.
It's a good question, Josh. I would say a couple of different options. We do have a multi and inter-arts program distinctly, And we have a number of applicants who may be eligible to multiple programs. The way I tend to guide artists is to say, like, think about your project and perhaps who you want the project to be assessed by. So who do you want around the table? So an example of that would be visual media artists, for example, who quite often flow back and forth between the visual artists and the media artist creation programs, depending on the specific project that they're applying for. And those assessors around the table for a media artist creation program would be a little bit different than the voices around the visual artist program. I try really hard not to be too like definitive about what visual arts has to be, because that's evolving constantly. And I rather that the community, be it the assessors or the applicants, are constantly giving us that feedback about what's a priority to them for their project. So quite often they're eligible to multiple programs, and we have some programs for all disciplines as well, where the disciplines share an assessment as well. So I tend to say, like, think about what specifically you want to get funded for, and then perhaps think a little bit about who you want to be at the table to review that project.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Peter?
Yeah, very, very similar. I mean, I think if you go to the website, you'll see it looks extremely rigid at Toronto Arts Council, but it isn't at all. I always suggest to an artist, like, if they can't figure out where they're supposed to be, you know, just contact the program managers that sound like they're the best one for them. And we are here to service the artists, so we will find a place for you if you can't find a place. And yeah, and a lot of it has to do with on where you come from, or what you're making, or who your audience might want to be, or who your community is that would be looking at it, that would make sense of the project the easiest. So yeah, don't fear if you're like making something that doesn't easily translate into one of the 8 categories that we have.
Excellent, thank you. And Isidra?
So as I mentioned, for the Creating, Knowing, and Sharing the Indigenous program, it is a multidisciplinary program. So everyone, all the disciplines apply together, and then they're assessed by a variety of different artistic practices, which then plays into, it's very important to know who you're writing to. So when writing a grant, you want to address it to the peer assessors, essentially. You want to be talking to them. And something I always tell the Indigenous artists applying to our program is that you really have to think about the fact that not everyone might be a photographer. So if you're using very specific terms to photography, explain them so that if a theater artist is at the table, which there usually is, they can understand what you're talking about. So sort of skip that shorthand. For Explore and Create, while all artistic disciplines apply to a certain section of it, so say research and creation, once they come in, they're then sort of divided out into different the artistic practices, so that music is all assessed together, theater's all assessed together, the new and early career artists are all assessed together. So those people who have less than 2 years experience, they have a chance. They're not going against these really large, well-established artists. So and that was part of why they created the new and early career artists program, was because it's, as a new artist approaching trying to write a grant, well, writing a grant for anyone can be scary, but if you're really new, it's really hard to be assessed next to somebody who has been writing grants for 20 years. So it's a great way of trying to even out the playing ground and make Canada Council more accessible to new artists. So yeah, they get so that's part of why when you create your profile, you have to sort of pick your artistic discipline. And then from there you get siphoned. And there is interdisciplinary program, like artist options. It's called interarts and multidisciplinary. And so they all get assessed together as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I will extend thanks to all three of you again, Peter Kingstone with Toronto Arts Council, Segu with Ontario Arts Council, and Isidra Cruz with Canada Council for the Arts. I'll say your presentations plus the questions that I've asked seem to have satisfied our audience. We have just one comment, which is the questions were so good. There are no more questions to be asked right now. But I will strongly encourage, I mean, of course, if you have the power of Google at your fingertips, you could Google any of these agencies. But if you're taking notes right now, Toronto Arts Council is torontoartscouncil.org. The Ontario Arts Council is www.arts.on.ca. And Canada Council is canadacouncil.ca. So once again, this is a program, I will say happily developed by the Power Plant. Thank you so much to Peter, to Tse, and to Isidra. This is part of this sort of larger ad hoc collective doing what's been sort of deemed by the 9 organizations, deemed the Horizon Initiative, which has been funded by the Toronto Arts Council Open Door stream. So thank you so much. And hopefully this information really invigorates us all and helps us move forward, as I'm just starting to see light at the end of this very long, dark tunnel. So best wishes to everyone. Please stay safe and stay healthy. Get vaccinated. I know this is not the typical forum for that, but please get vaccinated as soon as you can so that we can all be safe and we can all get back to the things that we love, going to galleries, seeing artwork, seeing performances, and so on. So thank you so much. Have a wonderful afternoon, and best wishes to all.